Prior to playing it, the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series has always been one that's caught my eye, but never really held my attention. I'd see screenshots and videos for it, I'd get loads telling me that I should check it out, and just generally I heard great things about it from people whose tastes I aligned with, but for one reason or another, I never really found myself all that interested. It seemed fun and dynamic, but nothing I heard ever really convinced me that it was my type of series, and with the sheer number of games that it contains, I was just never motivated to get around to it. However, a year into streaming, I was suddenly confronted with the fact that a lot of my audience seemed to love the series and really wanted me to give it a try, and I saw this as a cool opportunity. I mentioned that I wasn't sure if I'd like them, so I wouldn't be able to commit long-term from the start, and they were fine with it, and so a little while later, I was beginning my journey with this one-of-a-kind story with Yakuza 0, somehow believing that Majima was post-time skip Kiryu from the fragments of information and visuals I had seen prior to starting. Little did I know that starting this series on a whim would change my life. Having just rolled the credits on the final currently released game on the series, I can firmly and confidently conclude that Like a Dragon / Yakuza is without doubt one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, my current second favorite ahead of The Legend of Zelda, Metal Gear Solid, Pokemon, and Soulsborne, and only behind Final Fantasy. It is a special, special story with so much to offer that has infinite potential going forward, filled to the brim with unbelievable characters, a constant building of foundations leading to insane payoff, great audio-visual presentation, fun, silliness, and the occasional moment of hilariously bad writing. And all of these things make it wholly like a dragon. And despite the clear flaws that it has at times, it is one of the most honest, impressive, and personally resonant long-running series I've ever experienced, using the legacy and foundation that it sets for itself to the highest degree. I love this series so much, and having finished all currently released entries outside of Ishin, I now have a bit of a hole in my heart where the streams of it used to be. So I'm going to take this time to provide a reflection and retrospective of my experience throughout the story. Not going in full analysis mode, but briefly going over my experience with every entry, what I loved, what I disliked, what I took away from the character arcs and stories and themes, strengths, weaknesses, and all that sort of thing. I do want to give each entry the spotlight for at least a little bit, regardless of their place in my personal hierarchy. My experience with each individual game in the series varies wildly, despite thinking every single one is at least good, but I'll be going over which ones truly impressed and which were the mixed bags, finishing with a full series ranking at the end. If you'd like to see my playthrough of these games, you can check out my VOD channel, which has every single Yakuza stream I've ever done available and ready to watch if you'd like. And just to be clear, I won't be talking about either of the Judgment games here, though I totally enjoyed that series as well. Now without further ado, let's start at the beginning. I'll get this out of the way. From a narrative axis, Yakuza 0 is as close to perfection as it gets, in my opinion. Outside of maybe some tiny nitpicky pacing issues in and around Chapter 5, it is essentially perfect as a video game story to me. The cinematic visual presentation, the expressiveness in body language and animations, the voice acting, the structure of the plot, how it knows exactly when to switch viewpoints between Kiryu and Majima. The cast is phenomenal, and is in the conversation for the best one I've experienced in a single video game, with every single character of note, whether they be minor or major, having some sort of arc or role that contributes significantly to the overall narrative. Majima, Kiryu, Nishiki, Makoto, Sagawa, Tachibana, Oda, Kuze, Shibusawa, Nishitani, Kashiwagi, Shimano, Awano. Even more minor characters with less screen time like Lee or Billiken, or characters exclusive to side content like Yuki. Yakuza 0 is a masterclass in character writing. There are phenomenal dynamics everywhere, whether it be the beautiful yet heartbreaking relationship between Majima and Makoto, the transcendent bond between Kiryu and Nishiki, the conflicting, complex, and wonderful Majima and Sagawa relationship, the profoundly flawed Tachibana and Oda dynamic. There are ones that dictate a character's direction in future arcs, such as Kiryu Kuze or Majima Nishitani. There is the establishment between Kazuma, Kiryu, and Nishiki, as well as the hints about the future direction of these dynamics. Yakuza 0 as a narrative is somehow equal parts lyrical and shonen-esque adrenaline pumping, with substance everywhere, and there is no resource or expense wasted in bringing this poetic, beautiful, and raw story to life in every way, shape, or form. Side content is fantastic and essential to the thematic tapestry of the game. The emotions and payoff hit like mad in essentially every chapter, and every single major story beat is crafted with deliberate care and passion. And I'm of the opinion that Majima's arc in Zero is in the conversation for the most complex, rich, emotional, and layered I've ever seen in a game. Yakuza 0 is the least goofy and silly Yakuza game, and the main story can be quite dreary and gritty a lot of the time as these characters try to find a path for themselves in a world that seems to promise nothing, but there is heart and soul everywhere to offer respite and connection to the story. Needless to say, I adore Yakuza 0 beyond words, and my love for it has only grown over time, and streaming it was one of the most special experiences I've ever had. It is such a wonderful introduction to the series, and I can't think of a better way for my experience to have started. From here we progress into what many, myself included, tend to view as the lower period for the series in terms of quality. This range including Yakuza Kiwami 1 and Kiwami 2, Yakuza 3, and Yakuza 4. That isn't at all to say that these games are bad. Quite the contrary, there is tons to love in each of them. But there is also a notable amount of weaknesses or hilarious bad in these entries, and as a result they just aren't consistently masterful like the others are. And for Yakuza standards, not being a borderline masterpiece places it at the low end of the series. However, I still thoroughly enjoyed my journey throughout all of these, and I think they do plenty of things well. And we'll start off with Kiwami 1, the immediate sequel to Yakuza 0. I'm quite a big fan of this game, and I find myself defending it a decent amount. I think that there is some obvious bad in here. There is clearly a discrepancy in Majima characterization due to the difference in intent for the character between the stuff that was in the original game and the characterization applied to him from Zero, and as a result he has a couple of scenes that feel quite off. There is some awful execution about parenthood that is honestly pretty laughable in how widely it misses the mark, especially considering how well it could have all hit given Kazuma's death in this game. Jingu is a hilariously bad character, Seta just kinda flops, and Yumi is the epitome of wasted potential. I just couldn't bring myself to care for her at all, and it's a shame that the game didn't establish her better emotionally. No! I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Although, I do have to thank goodness for Gaiden for retroactively making her better. But back on topic, there is just generally a sloppiness throughout the game that is a far cry from the pristine writing of Zero, and I think there's a huge disparity in the quality of the character cast that is felt without a doubt. But regardless, there is still a lot to love here for me. There is some inconsistency with Majima, but the good stuff is hella good, super rich with complexity and layers. Date is introduced, and while I don't think that he becomes a great character until Yakuza 6, he is consistently entertaining and has good moments, and this is the start of it. Kamurocho as a setting is fleshed out well, and of course we have the introduction of Haruka, who doesn't really come into her own as a character until much later, but who is great given her role here and unlocks a side to Kiryu that'll be essential to his character going forward. But the star of the show is of course Nishiki, whose downward spiral is incredibly devastating, tragic, and disturbing to witness, making the game very upsetting to play at times, paying off the foundations of his character that were laid in Zero and ensuring that his and Kiryu's relationship is cemented as one of the best and most emotional in the series. My second favorite, personally. I cannot listen to Tonight without tearing up. I can't think of Nishiki without thinking of what could have been, and honestly, to this day, he is still one of my absolute favorite characters in the series. And so given all of this, I can't help but really like Kiwami 1. There are tons of flaws here, but I totally think that the strengths outweigh them by far, and it achieves a ton in terms of atmosphere, tragic and rich character writing, and laying foundations for future entries in the series. Next up, we have a game that is incredibly near and dear to my heart, Yakuza Kiwami 2. This story is absolute batshit insanity from start to finish. The lows are hilariously bad, the highs are unbelievably peak. It is everything Yakuza distilled into one game, and even if I think the bad stuff drags it down a bit too much for it to be a favorite, I wouldn't change a thing about it for the world. The presentation here is spectacular, and as my first exposure to the Dragon engine, I found myself adjusting a bit to the new character models, but overall loving the rich visuals, the new and vibrant Kamurocho, and the really cinematic, dynamic approach. I do think that overall, Yakuza 0, 7, Gaiden, or Infinite Wealth are more my speed in terms of overall direction than Kiwami 2, and I think they did a bit more there in terms of characterization through framing and little details, but Kiwami 2 is still fantastic in this regard and has some of my favorite presentation in the series. While there are some characters throughout the story that didn't fulfill the potential they had, such as Kawada, the overall cast is a step up on Kiwami 1 for me. Daigo's introduction is fantastic, and although I didn't start adoring him as a fantastic character until later, the establishment for him here is great. And while the series seems to, mostly, forget that she exists after this entry, I really like Sayama and found her to be well fleshed out and very likable, with a great dynamic with Kiryu. And I really liked the Majima saga, which offered a really emotional end to Majima's Makoto arc and offered him some finality and peace. This is also a generally pretty strong game for Kiryu too, and while I would have liked a bit more focus on his internal psychology and his shifting insecurities and thoughts about Kazuma, along with how he's coping with Nishiki's death, that sort of thing would come later, and what we got was enough for this to be a pretty notable net positive for him. But the absolute star of the show here, and the reason that this game is as good as it is Ryuji Goda, who I consider to this day to still be one of my absolute favorite RGG characters and arguably the one with the most presence and aura. I was hanging on to every word he said with bated breath, and the final fight with him on the brink of death was one of the most raw, hype things I've ever experienced. And I actually found his dynamic with Sayama to be really good too. I could see how some would lament it not being more, but I think it was really powerful in a minimalistic way. And honestly, if it wasn't for Ryuji, I think the finale of the story would have been almost exclusively comprised of awful writing, because the way the last few hours swing from peak to abyss is something to behold. But like I alluded to, I wouldn't change it for the world. The awful pacing throughout the middle act, the underground golden castle, the tiger, the secret Koreans, the insane nonsensical twists, Terada, Takashima. The end of this game is an absolute fever dream, and while it is incredibly messy, I'm so glad that it is exactly what it is. Where's my weapon go? Look. Oh my god.
その声は寺だ。
What now? What now?
Takashima.
Oh my god.
私にとって邪魔な人間を予定通り次々と葬ってくれました。
There's a trail of bodies! Twist after twist after twist, there's a body representing each twist. They just pile up. Ryuji's there, Terada's there, Sea of Flames Man is there, and now Takashima! I didn't even know his name until this point. That's a confession of mine. I didn't know his name. I was so close to saying who, even though I knew who he was. I didn't know his name until this point. Who are you? I know he's important. He's been skulking in the back.
お前は用済みだ。
No fucking way! No fucking way! He just killed him!
お前のことなんか信
Then
じ
why didn't you do something, Terada? Why didn't you?
まだ生きてた。
How
この死に損ない
how stupid are you? If you knew something,
桐生さん、
he's still going!
あんたしかい
What
ない
is he made of?
信じて
Trust you? Trust you? Why? Why would I trust you?
何
What a stream this was. Yeah, Kiwami 2 is pretty good. Yakuza 3 is such an interesting case for me. It starts off incredibly, with one of the strongest openings to any game in the series. We see this softer, fatherly, more peaceful side to Kiryu as he cares for the children in the orphanage, and Okinawa's soft sunsets do wonders for accentuating and reflecting this new side to him. I adored this slow, gentle start and loved what it did for Kiryu, and the game continues quite strongly, introducing several antagonist figures, including a certain Yoshitaka Mine, and one of the most endearing characters up until this point, Rikiya. From here, however, the plot loses focus and instead starts prioritizing incredibly strangely, in my opinion. Kashiwagi's death was extremely disappointing for me as the character was never properly given an opportunity to shine like I believed he could. But more on that later. The whole Black Monday thing was horrendously overplayed, and Chapter 9, the plot, is by far the most hilariously dull and worst RGG chapter of all time, as Tamiya drones on forever about shallow, boring politics, redundantly treading the same ground over and over and repeating himself again and again. I was in shock, and the best way to exemplify how bad it was is through the following statement. Akio Otsuka played a character and I found myself just wanting him to get off my screen. I also think the middle act of this game misses the mark a ton when it comes to Kiryu's parenthood. He does some things throughout that I think are concerning examples of bad parenting, and I think that could have been really intriguing because Lord knows Kiryu didn't have a normal upbringing, and adding some very intentionally, on the part of RGG, not Kiryu, bad parenting to mix with his really good and heartfelt parenting at times would have given him great layers in this game. However, the game really doesn't seem to think that it's a bad thing when he waits and sees and allows Haruka to conduct shady under-the-table dealings for money, or when he chastises each child individually for their sister running away while that sister is out alone in the city. This game shows Kiryu being a great father and a bad father, and I think that's the foundation for some great stuff, but it doesn't seem to intend for this to be portrayed as bad, and it totally loses me there. Although luckily, Yakuza 5 and 6 and on would retrospectively correct this down the line by revisiting his time at the orphanage in a more critical manner, thereby elevating and deepening Kiryu as a character, and therefore elevating Yakuza 3 a bit. Also, the Joji subplot is absolutely awful and he had no business being in this game at all, cheapening the impact of an otherwise wonderfully gutting Rikiya death. What are you doing here? I found the finale of the game to be quite good. It is incredibly goofy through Andre Richardson's sheer presence, but like I alluded to, I can really get into and enjoy really entertaining bad stuff, and this qualifies for sure. Mine's character is extremely backloaded, but nonetheless, the way his backstory and current motives revealed this really striking dynamic with Kiryu was really good, illustrating why Kiryu is this eternal, hopeful struggler against all odds and providing a great thematic antithesis. Mine's relationship with Daigo is pretty good too, and his conclusion hits extremely hard. I didn't love Mine quite as much as I thought I would, and wished that he was fleshed out a bit more prior to his conclusion, but nonetheless I do still really like him. Maybe a Kiwami 3 could make him even better. And the game ends on what I view as a pretty poetic encapsulation of Kiryu's hardcore, at times self-detrimental stubbornness and adherence to his principles, paving the way for the path that he would need to take going forward. Yakuza 3 is a mixed bag, similar to the Kiwamis in terms of how the greatness is juxtaposed by some big misses, but I do appreciate it for what it does. The last entry in this quote-unquote era of Yakuza is Yakuza 4, and while I learned prior to playing it that it was maybe the least popular entry in the series, at least in the circles that I frequent, I still really enjoyed it. I think of Yakuza 4 as a foundational and formative entry in the series, where the staff began experimenting boldly with the things that they would polish down the line. You can see them beginning to experiment with the visuals, with some stunning sequences and shots throughout, even if they don't quite reach the peaks of later releases, and here is where they first began experimenting with multiple protagonists in the games. And while all of this isn't masterfully done and was improved upon exponentially down the line, Yakuza 4 was the catalyst, and I really appreciate it for that. However, it isn't possible to ignore some of the flaws here. I don't think that it's a problem that this is the smallest role that Kiryu has so far in the series and actually applaud the intent to change things up, but his material is very spotty and feels somewhat underused in the places he is. Add to that the horrific approach to the uncomfortable Saejima Haruka scene, and that makes this one Kiryu's weakest game by far to me. But in addition to this, I think what makes Yakuza 4 one of the weakest entries in the series is that it's somehow the most forgettable story to me. The way I interact with stories is I experience them, reflect on them, and think about them as my appreciation or thoughts on them grows over time. However, while every game in this series doesn't have a problem with that, even the ones lower on my list, Yakuza 4 is the exception. Every game is full of characters and moments that stick in my memory, but I've forgotten so much about Yakuza 4. It simply doesn't stick out in my mind in terms of plot or characters outside of a few highlights. The multiple plots and perspectives throughout are pretty good, with Saejima's and Akiyama's being highlights, but they're overall sort of thin and lacking in cohesion between one another, and the many Yakuza 4 exclusive characters and antagonists just don't distinguish themselves much. And for that reason, it's not as stark a game for me. Yet as I said, there's still a lot of good here too. The game really effectively introduces series staples in Saejima and Akiyama and Hana. And Takemura's pretty cool too. The atmosphere is really moody and rich, and I love it, and much to the chagrin of naysayers, I fully believe that one of the most infamous things about not just this game but the whole series, the rubber bullets plot point, is, wait for it, good. It's insane and goofy and kinda stupid, but that is Yakuza in a nutshell, and it doesn't undercut anything about Saejima's character in terms of his intent and guilt, and overall I just think it's good stuff. And the finale is kinda odd and confusing, but generally pretty hype nonetheless too. In my experience, revolution in storytelling and games can often be messy, whereas evolution can refine and polish things up, leading to a more consistent and powerful experience. And Yakuza 4 was the revolution needed for the games after it to succeed in the ways that they did. Overall, none of the games that I've talked about in this section are personal favorites of mine. And yet, I was okay with that and still thoroughly enjoyed each for different reasons, as long as we ramped up in quality and hopefully entered masterful territory as we entered the production era that intersected with Zero. I was eagerly anticipating seeing how the series reached those heights in character writing and presentation, and I was wondering if it would be able to touch the heavens once more. And it did. Something was in the air or the water at RGG Studios in the ensuing years between the releases of Yakuza 4 and Yakuza 5, because it really seems like the moment we hit the production cycle of 5 and on, all of these creators suddenly drank some peak fiction juice and began going wild with their storytelling. Every single Yakuza or Like a Dragon story at or after this point was just cooked with a different sort of sauce. This was more than a return to form reminiscent of Zero. This was entering into a brand new era of Yakuza full of such different aims and strengths that made me feel things that I never thought I'd feel with the series. It provided me with such insane set pieces, characters, dynamics, story elements, and thematics that I didn't know I needed, but that I'm so pleased I got. Of course, I don't mean to say that these games are perfect, and honestly to this day I don't think any story has been quite as blemish-free as Zero other than maybe Gaiden, but that doesn't mean that they didn't hit or threaten to surpass the highs of Zero. This era catapulted Yakuza into a pillar of video game storytelling, and it all started with Yakuza 5. Now, this game is not flawless. I think that it has some pacing issues and bloat, particularly around Part 2, that it really undercut itself by not properly expanding upon Majima and Park's relationship, and that it has some very bizarre scenes tonally that are incredibly bad, particularly this one about Forger-san that completely misses the mark. And yet, the flaws pale in comparison to the positives. This story boasts one of the most impressive casts in the series and easily the best one since Zero up till this point. The presentation is more creative and visually interesting, and there just seems to be a set plan for the story. Nearly every character, old or new, has a purpose and role in the story, and none of them are misused or wasted like in previous entries. The plotting is very deliberate, and the thematics are out of this world. Every time we'd reach a development that had me worrying that they'd descend into clownery like they had in previous games, we instead got great quality. We have such fantastic new characters like Watase, who offers such a great dynamic with Kiryu and such interesting ideologies. Then there's Park, so layered and nuanced, with one of my favorite relationships in the series with Haruka. Baba, who reflects multiple characters and acts as a foil in such a great way. Kurosawa, the ultimate thematic antithesis of an antagonist. Takasugi, who hits similar notes to Sagawa but is completely different as well. And Shinada, who immediately became one of my favorite Yakuza characters of all time through his seemingly isolated arc that coalesced with the overall narrative of dreams and the nuances of them. Aizawa is very good too, as an example of someone struggling to come to terms with the fragments of a dream hoisted on him. And Haruka is phenomenal and finally becomes the magnificent character that she promised to be. There are fantastic dynamics all over the place, and somehow it all coalesces beautifully in one of the most hype, raw, shonen, and thematically cohesive games not just in the series, but that I've ever played. Yakuza 5 is spectacular. It's not totally clean or subtle, but it is bursting with heart, wonderful characters, fantastic scenes, and uplifting themes, and more than anything, it encouraged me and got me incredibly excited for the series going forward. I enjoyed Kiwami 1 to Yakuza 4, but this was the peak I had signed up for, and I was delighted to be back. And that continued wonderfully into Yakuza 6, A Song of Life, a bona fide masterpiece. Very soon after starting 6, I found that the best way for me to look at it and Yakuza 5 was as a tandem. Two sides of the same coin, two parts of the same story within the grander scope of the series. Of course, they are incredibly different. Yakuza 5 is grand and sprawling, with a huge cast and so many cities, whereas Yakuza 6 is very tight and focused, with one of the smallest casts in the series. Yakuza 5 covers so many different perspectives, whereas Yakuza 6 is essentially all about Kiryu, the ultimate monolithic character piece, along with Gaiden. Yakuza 5 tackles motherhood to a great degree, and Yakuza 6 fatherhood. The games could not be more different in approach, and yet, that is why they work so beautifully together. Opposites attract here. Yakuza 5 brings forth an idea, and 6 is a direct rebuttal to balance it out and complete the picture thematically. In specifics, Yakuza 5 champions the beauty of ideals and dreams, and while Yakuza 6 acknowledges that, it touts the importance of also keeping one's feet on the ground. It states that living in reality without losing oneself due to being chained to dreams is essential, and that in doing so, one can take responsibility and be true to oneself, primed to pass on their values to the next generation. And the way this theme is reflected by the characters is unbelievable. We have the loving yet pathologically twisted and destructive bond between Hirose and his foster sons, between Bigelow and Jimmy, and how Kiryu learns from all of it to reflect on his relationships with Haruka, Haruto, Daigo, and Yuta, as well as what Kazuma imparted to him. In addition, we have the integrated theme of the passing of the torch from the former generations of Yakuza to the new ones, who often find themselves unable to step out of the shadow of the legacy of older ones due to reasons associated with strength or frustrating similarities, which encapsulates Jungi and Someya's roles in very simple terms. And with all that said, it all comes together with Kiryu. He is the beginning and end here, and he was inevitable, as with taking everything into account, the end of 6 is where he became my official favorite character in the series. This Song of Life is all about him, tightly focused on his journey as he comes to grips with the burden of his legacy and how he wants to approach his future and his relationships with his loved ones, and Onomichi is this beautifully quiet, reflective setting to allow for Kiryu to learn these things about himself along with these like-minded brothers that he finds. The game is very upfront with the fact that basically all of the other protagonists outside of Akiyama were going to be taking a back seat, and instead it built centrally upon Kiryu's personal development and outward from there, because everything feeds into that. Hirose and Kurusu, the Hirose boys, Haruka and Haruto and Yuta, Jungi and Someya, Bigelow and Jimmy, Date, Daigo. How Iwami is this complete antithesis, inverse, and bastardization. The themes of passing on the torch, and of parenthood, and of connections, and valuing what matters. It's all about Kiryu. With the future of his loved ones secured, he was free to fight with all that he had to protect them, with no fear or hesitancy. And in this journey of his where he did so much right and plenty of wrong, where he experienced loss and grief and tragedy, but also fun and wisdom and love, here he ensured that the important things were passed on to those that he loved, regardless of whether they had his blood or not. To Haruka, to Haruto, to Daigo. Haruto's steps coalescing with Kiryu's walk paralleling Majima, him being dead to the world, all he sacrificed, the lyrics of Hands. The ending of this game was so unbelievable, so tragic yet hopeful. It had me bawling my eyes out and devastated for weeks. This game is a bona fide 10 out of 10 despite some flaws, and this was the most emotional I had ever felt at a Yakuza ending. At least at that point in the series. Now, I knew to expect a couple of things heading into Yakuza Like a Dragon. I knew that it had a reputation for being known as a new beginning within the series. I knew that it was generally viewed as bold. And, I mean, it's hard to miss that the main guy on the promotional material isn't Kiryu. Add to that the way that Yakuza 6 seemed to offer a conclusion of sorts for Kiryu, at least for a while, and I was expecting this one to be a bit of a new beginning, with all the risks and excitement that comes with that. And that ended up being the case. However, the quality that it approached this with totally blew me away. Like a Dragon is incredibly bold and courageous in terms of how it totally shifts the approach to story and gameplay, and it completely cements its own identity and reframes the scope of the series beautifully, but it also does so while paying tribute and maintaining the original soul of the series so well. The change to a JRPG formula felt so natural, and Yakuza was just so clearly a series to benefit from JRPG staples such as party talks, drink links, and more. And to shift from such an icon, such a legend, and such a rich protagonist in Kiryu to someone completely new was necessary for this point in the series, but it was undoubtedly a huge risk, and they had to ensure that the new guy was special enough to carry forward the series and fill such gigantic shoes. It was a tremendous undertaking, but fortunately, Ichiban Kasuga is a life-changing character and one of my favorite of all time, a complete bastion of inspiration. The way he's this force of nature for hope, his unrelenting perseverance, how he sweeps others up in his storm in ways reminiscent of Naruto or Luffy, his relationships with his party, Masami, Masato, and more, how his idealistic desire to become a hero integrates with the changing gameplay through his perspective, his empathy, compassion, and forgiveness. He is a character that changes worlds. He feels like he is an aberration that shouldn't be able to exist in this world, just like Kiryu, carrying forward his themes and legacy, but in a totally different way. He's empathetic, compassionate, courageous, and shonen as hell, and he is so easy to love, which adhered me to him immediately. And that only grew as the story continued. By the end of the game, he was already a top 3 character in the series for me. But there is far more to this cast than just him. While they would become great later, the party is good, with emotional dynamics throughout and some really interesting characterization for Jungi, who I immediately began referring to as Twingi. The support characters are solid enough and all play their roles. Tendo is raw as hell, and specifically Joe Sawashido shocked me with how absolutely amazing he ended up being. Masami is absolutely wonderful, this tragic figure bound by this world who never felt like he could exist outside of it, with such emotional relationships with Masato and Ichiban. And Masato is completely out of this world masterful, with such an interesting, tragic psychology and such a poetic, emotional dynamic with Ichiban. This game has arguably the greatest start to any Yakuza game and one of the greatest ends to one. It has some of the best visual direction up until this point without a doubt. It is exceedingly clever and yet so heartfelt, and it just inspires at every turn. It definitely isn't perfect, of course. There are some big gameplay balance issues and some clunkiness that needed to be polished, and there's some classic Yakuza goofiness and stupidity to help us remember that these writers are human. The random-ass Nanba brother plotline for this character that we never ever see and his fiancé? Good for them, I guess? And Mirror Face as a character is one of the most insane things the series has ever done. And the approach taken with Nonomiya overall was weird too. But in spite of the flaws, this is still masterful. It's a journey that travels from rock bottom to the top of the Millennium Tower and tells us that it's never too late, in spite of how the personification of said hope admits that he often thought of the draw of death. It's a story of callbacks and tributes to the legacy of the series through costumes, sub-stories, karaoke, and disco songs, the wonderful reappearance of Kashiwagi and the Survive Bar, the old faces that return to accentuate and elevate the story and further reinforce this new era. This is a story about stories and how they empower our lives, a love letter to video games and the Yakuza series, and ultimately, like its predecessor, this is a song of life that tells us that it's never too late to start over, and that the stories we love are as important to real life as we will them to be. Keep living, and see you tomorrow. I'm a fucking mess. Like a Dragon Gaiden is honestly one of the biggest accomplishments in the series to me, considering the frankly tiny development cycle, the really difficult section of the story that they chose to tell in terms of chronology, and how tricky it is to continue telling Kiryu's story after what works as a genuine goodbye in Yakuza 6. This game could have crashed and burned. But it didn't at all, and is instead one of the best entries in the series, a poetic allegory of Kiryu at this point in his life, the cast around him so efficiently being projections of himself along with being fully fleshed out characters. It is just as much of a statement of the series' legacy as 7, but done in a much more personal, focused way. And it goes without saying, but this is more or less the sequel to 6. While 6 was about Kiryu sacrificing himself and letting go of his life for the sake of those he loves while passing on the important things that he's learned from his experiences, this was about him slowly coming to terms with leaving this world and ensuring that his impact is as positive as possible. Kiryu says it, he is literally dead. He is a ghost, and as he reflects on the people that he's met and the things that he's done throughout the series, he prepares for his death. There are callbacks to Nishiki, Majima, Nishitani, Ryuji, Kazuma, Yumi, Aizawa, the kids of course, and his own exploits and stories, and this game once again does that thing where it retroactively makes previous games better through this. And the Yakuza 0 parallels are so clear. From the way the opening cinematic reflects the tone of Kiryu's first walk through Kamurocho, or how he seems to be in the situation that Majima was in 0, in the same city no less. Caged, exhausted, wearing a mask. He learns about how legacies can be misconstrued and misrepresented and tries to ensure that his impact is as good as he can make it while coming to terms with the fact that his name cannot be erased. Not fully. His story is too grand and impactful. And yet, he must learn to reconcile with the good that he's done that he acknowledges in 6, but never fully embraces, while letting go of his entire life. The easy part was making the choice. The hard part is dealing with the consequences. Not being able to see those he loves, dwelling on past joys and mistakes, the loneliness and desolation. From start to finish, this game is cinematic to the fullest in portraying Kiryu's isolation, with the opening scene mirroring his desolation in Yakuza 0, but for totally different reasons, as I said. Gaiden is Kiryu having died effectively and trying to set his affairs in order and prepare himself for when he's gone. But it's so lonely. And Hanawa, who is a beautiful nod to Kiryu's actual legacy, the true person he was, and someone who is a confidant that celebrates that, is someone that I really think saved his life through being the one connection of warmth and understanding. It's a beautiful relationship. And ditto Akame, whose lovely energy helped him to see hope and light in the darkest time of his life so far. Nishitani III is a fun-as-hell, caricaturish personification of both the misrepresentative legacy theme and of the fallout of the dissolution of the Yakuza, and Sudano is a very nuanced, layered projection of the side of Kiryu that hates the Yakuza culture and his own identity within it and wants to see it gone, with Shishido being the monstrous, aspirational struggler crawling himself up from the bottom. A man who has known nothing but pain but has created a life for himself through the Yakuza, who fights to ensure his identity, purpose, and life are not destroyed. This game does so well in showing the fallout of this choice to disband the Yakuza and how while there are tons of positives that would result from disbandment and while it isn't sustainable, this entity is something that likewise leads to people's lives being saved and essential connections being made. Shishido could only exist as a Yakuza. Watase, Daigo and co. are killing him, and many others feel tossed to the side as well, and so they all fight for their life here. Shishido refuses to let his name be erased, and he faces off against the man who erases his name. He's a fully fleshed out, wonderful character in his own right, but he also represents this side of Kiryu. The side that loves the Yakuza, loves a good bloody fight, the monster inside him that screams out in defiance to not let go. But Kiryu sees the pain that it causes to those uninvolved, and he sees that he cannot let it stand. And so, in what I consider to be the best final fight in the series, a masterful allegory, he puts Shishido and his own internal thoughts to rest, in what has been a battle inside him for decades. Shishido represents the terrible pain of letting go of the past, the feeling that there is nothing left to hold on to without it, and I think he's very meta in representing the audience and perhaps the developer's pain at letting go of that era of Yakuza as a franchise and moving on into this new, scary era of uncertainty. Gaiden is a symbolic preparation for death, a victory lap of Kiryu's legacy and memories as he reflects on where he's been, where he's at now, how he suffers in loneliness, and how he will do all that he can in spite of that to die a good death. And that scene, you know the one. It may be the hardest I've cried while playing an RGG game. This game is without doubt one of the most impressive feats in the series, and it paves the way for the ultimate culmination. I truly believe that in my Yakuza / Like a Dragon journey, we saved the best for last. Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth is definitely not perfect and stumbles a few times, but the positives so vastly outweigh the small amount of negatives that the moment it nailed the landing for me, I knew that it was my favorite. It is bizarrely good, and the perfect sequel to Like a Dragon in many ways. The gameplay is a significant upgrade in every way, the variation on dungeon aesthetics and the awesome set pieces are so much fun, it continues to integrate said gameplay with story elements, they even improved the drink links, although they could still use a little work. The visuals are absolutely stunning, the plot is varied and diverse but not too bloated or unfocused, the theming is so incredibly allegorical and rich, and due to the context of Kiryu's situation and how it echoes throughout the narrative, this is comfortably the most emotional game in the series for me. I did 15 chunky streams of this game and I cried in at least 12 of them. And that is because of how this game plays on its legacy, its most iconic and, in my opinion, best character, and provides him with a platform to confront his mortality, his life, who he is and what he's left behind, and accept all of who he is, to regret the bad and embrace the good, and reclaim his name. Ichiban is easily the second most prominent character outside of Kiryu, but instead of this being a character piece revolving around him, he instead takes up the role of the ultimate support character, helping those around him, forgiving them when they don't deserve it, and carrying the burden of the sins of others with a smile while constantly offering them a way forward. This game is about Kiryu, but without Ichiban, nothing would have been achieved and Kiryu never would have been able to move past his cyclical torment, value himself, and fight for his life. Honestly, I think that basically every game in the series prior is elevated due to Infinite Wealth. New characters such as Chitose, Eiji, and Yamai are absolute home runs, once again with arcs carried forward due to Ichiban's support. All of the party members from Like a Dragon return and are elevated through more complementary story material, new interactions and roles, and just generally improved prioritization. Nanba is much improved, for example, and Zhao's interactions with Kiryu really helped me buy into him as a personality. Ichiban and Saiko's relationship is great, as long as they're in a relationship in the next game, and Seonhee becoming a party member was everything I wanted and more, with a fantastic dynamic with Kiryu, who sees in her someone a lot like himself. Tomizawa is very solid, Sawashido and Masami are elevated, Bryce is hard to take seriously at first but is overall quite a compelling antithesis and foil. The Hanawa death was bizarrely handled but understandable given the respective development cycles of Gaiden and Infinite Wealth. Hawaii as a setting is sublime for being this spiritual oasis and afterlife for Kiryu to get clarity, only to then show how that can get exploited and corrupted. And from when we hit Chapter 8 and the Dragon Memoirs, all the stuff with Kiryu, Date's immense elevation through the lifelinks, Kashiwagi and Kiryu's amazing little talks, seeing so many old faces, the tears just kept flowing. The Dragon Memoirs are masterful, totally brilliant self-aware references to the legacy of Kiryu and the series as he constantly battles within himself to deal with what his life was and is. And the inclusion of Majima, Saejima, and Daigo was masterfully done too. But with all this established, the one thing I was waiting for was for the game to nail the ending, like I mentioned. I had heard that a pretty common opinion was that the story for this game sucks, that the ending is weak, and I'd be lying if I said that a little part of me wasn't apprehensive given those thoughts, regardless of how vehemently I disagreed with them up until the finale, and especially given that Yakuza as a series is prone to slip-ups at times. But I was delighted with the finale. Ichiban's route ties together his character and foils it with the concepts of Bryce beautifully, and Chitose's arc reaches a stunning conclusion, serving as not a finale worthy of ending the game, but a great foundation for the true ending. Kiryu's conclusion after embodying the dragon of Dojima. Ebina is a curious character, but to me his design is incredibly effective and karmic, an embodiment of all of the sins of the Yakuza, and Kiryu himself relates to an extent to his hatred and vitriol for them. In role, Ebina is the anti-Shishido, rejecting all that the Yakuza stand for, and Kiryu has elements of both Shishido and Ebina inside him. But here he battles allegorically against his own self-hatred using the bonds that he's grown and the things that he's learned to embrace himself for all that he is and forgive himself to break the cycle. And in so doing, in accepting and reclaiming himself, he reclaims this bursting desire to live. I think it's all reflected in the Judgment song, which became my favorite karaoke song after Infinite Wealth's recontextualization. This roar of defiance and triumph in the face of everything, cherishing all. That is Yakuza to me, and that is Kiryu to me, and this is a send-off and tribute and celebration of all that he is. And yet, despite all of this, the thing that breaks the cycle for Kiryu and the catalyst for this change, as well as the answer going forward and the new face of the series, is Ichiban. He is essential, and his pure empathy and compassion and idealism helped transfer his worldview to Kiryu to allow him to see things through his lens, as he turns Kiryu into a JRPG protagonist able to see these challenges as obstacles that he can overcome. Kiryu is facing the ultimate difficulty in his life, not cancer, but what it represents for his happiness and how he views himself and his life. But Ichiban transfers his hope and shows how stories and video games are not just stories. They can be life-affirming and life-saving, and through what they teach us, they can help us tackle life struggles with courage and conviction. And what better story to get courage from than Kiryu's life? And along with that, Ichiban's frankly bizarre ability to turn the other cheek and forgive and make friends with those who frankly don't deserve it does feel stupid at times, but that supposed foolishness may be the only answer, as we see in what is quite simply one of the most remarkable scenes I've ever seen. These things inspire, and Ichiban inspires. He is a true hero. The Kiryu and Ichiban dynamic here is just the greatest thing ever, and the game's very non-subtle subtext at how elements of Nishiki are reflected in Ichiban was not lost on me at all. This game is about valuing connections and forging ahead, embracing life, living for oneself and seeing possibility. And Ebina, as the perfect foil to Ichiban and Kiryu, saw none of that. He foils Ichiban because he is born in similar circumstances from the same man, but his experiences made him see a hilariously cruel and futile darkness while Ichiban saw every defeat as a chance to grow. And he foils Kiryu because he detests all that the Yakuza are, denounces them. But while Kiryu doesn't regret a thing about the disillusion, he now embraces all that he is and sees the beauty in Yakuza. Shishido represented a part of Kiryu screaming for it to not die, and Kiryu had essentially put that part to rest. But this is him saying that that part did have value, that his life was worthwhile despite his mistakes. What Kiryu asks Ebina to do is the unthinkable. Even if he has no right, he asks for forgiveness, for himself and for the Yakuza. And Ebina just sits in stunned disbelief. Kiryu acknowledges that Ebina has no reason to see hope in the Yakuza, and so he begs him to forgive, otherwise nothing will change. And he knows that it's a bizarre thing to ask, because why would anyone forgive such an unforgivable situation? But that is exactly what Ichiban does, time and time again, as he bears the cross of Eiji's sins, literally carrying him to his judgment, saving him in the way that he couldn't quite save Masato due to Masato's karma rearing its head. Ichiban is that aberration, that bizarre miracle of a human being, and so he can pick up the torch. This story is about hope, about legacy, about life, about breaking cycles of trauma and hatred within and outside of oneself, about life-saving bonds, and about confronting truths to take life head-on. It is the most spiritual and poetic Yakuza game about what it means to persevere and keep living, to keep trying and not to just exist. Just like Kiryu and just like Ichiban, this is a game that really shouldn't exist as it is. It is that remarkable, but somehow it still does. And I'm so glad it's here to offer me a comforting hug and a word of encouragement. I've just finished, so I don't know for sure, but I think Infinite Wealth will be something that I think back to and revisit for years to come to encourage me to persevere. It's a song of life. All of us, we have to keep going. This is my current ranking of the games, as shown through my backlogged account, which is linked in the description. Yakuza 0, 5, 6, 7, Gaiden, and Infinite Wealth are all favorites, but as I've explained, all of the games in the series are at least good, and the series as a whole just means so much to me. It has altered my life for the better, and the entire journey, minus a chunk of Yakuza 3, is on camera and available to watch at any time, which I'm truly thankful for. Check out the streams if you want. They're all out there, and they're on my second channel, which is linked. The playlist is as well. But more importantly, I hope you enjoyed this very personal and self-indulging retrospective on this series. I can't state enough how much I respect the people at RGG for being able to constantly keep this series fresh and bold while never forgetting its roots. It's never perfect, and there are always stumbles, but more than anything, they've crafted one of the best casts ever and a story that consistently reflects on itself, dwells in despair, and offers a future in spite of the pain, with memories and connection being that respite. I can't wait to see where things will go in the future, and I'll be there for it every step of the way. Many thanks for watching, and for being a part of my journey.
お名前フルネームで教えていただけますか。
桐生一馬だ。